Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cisco Optics Podcast, where we talk about optics for networking. What are the industry's technical experts in pluggable optics thinking about today? What are the technical boundaries that the smartest minds are pushing past to make the next generation of high-speed optics? If you're wondering about this, we have just the person for you. This is episode 6, where we continue a conversation with my esteemed colleague, Mark Nowell. Dr. Nowell is a Cisco fellow, and for good reason. In my 8.5 years at Cisco, I've known him to be a highly respected and influential leader, not only at Cisco, but the entire optics industry. In this second part of our 4-part conversation, we begin talking about thermal considerations, which he's been thinking and writing about lately. Mark Nowell is a Cisco fellow in Cisco's Optics and Optical Systems group. His focus is on next-generation interconnect technology innovation to meet Cisco's needs. Mark is also active within the industry standards and forums and has chaired multiple IEEE 802.3 Ethernet projects. He represents Cisco on various industry alliances and consortiums. Mark also chairs a number of industry multi-source agreement groups focusing on next-generation optical module form factors such as QSPDD and QSPDD 800, and optical interface signaling technology like the 100G Lambda MSA. I challenge you to find someone more qualified for this conversation. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast. It might show up as the Cisco Podcast Network, which has other great podcast series as well. Check out our blog at blogs.cisco.com and search on hashtag Cisco Optics Blog, all one word, no hyphen, and no spaces. For our YouTube playlist, go to youtube.com and search on Cisco Optics. And for product information, go to cisco.com/go/optics. And now, join me as I talk with Mark Nowell. All right, so enough of history. What has been on your mind recently? What's top of mind today for you?
Well, one of the things I thought we could talk about in the context of everything you just went over is the concept of thermals and cooling around these pluggable modules. It's sort of become I don't want to use it, but say a hot topic, but it's very much a front of mind topic.
And why is that? For
the industry? Well, it's large for a bunch of reasons. The capacities, we're trying to keep up with the growth of the network, right? The growth of traffic, and we've all seen the traffic projections.
It's just never ending. It's always the same chart, just different numbers on the scale, right?
It is, right? It's basically we're all consuming more and more data. We all have more and more devices. More people are getting devices, and it's just growing. And so at some point, all of this traffic comes together, either in the SP networks, service provider networks on their backbones, or more importantly, in recent years in the web scale data centers, right? So the Facebook and Amazon and Microsoft data centers, and they've got a incredibly challenging problem to solve, which is how do they deal with that capacity of traffic coming in and figure out how to put all that equipment in a building and interconnect it together. And they move to an architecture, they use an architecture which is often referred to as a leaf spine architecture, and that allows them a high degree of operational efficiency in terms of adding bandwidth, as quickly as they need to, and adding capacity to it. And one of the consequences of this leaf spine is there's a large amount of interconnect between the different layers. There's a sort of an every port to every port interconnect optically. And so what that means is the volume of the optical interconnect within these data centers is very, very high.
So it's many interconnects per node, whether it's in the leaf or the spine, right?
Correct, right? Much more than if you looked at how a service provider network would have been built. They would have had a big box at the top and small boxes at the bottom, but they would have had a different levels of oversubscription and a lot of network planning going on. So every time they wanted to add something, they would have to recalculate all the capacities. Whereas a leaf spine is generally very flat, different levels, but 2, 3, 4 levels, but very homogeneous across, and just a lot of interconnect. So they can just keep adding to this, and they don't have to go do a whole bunch of network calculations. And it's a fantastic architecture, but it does have that consequence.
And having all those interconnects means like one server can talk to another server without having to go through, multiple vertical levels. There's a lot of you can go, they call it east to west, but you can go east to west across the network with minimal hops to keep your latency down, and right.
And those are all good things. But from an optical point of view, or it means that the equipment has to have a lot of ports on it. Mm-hmm. And it means that there has to be, and there's just many of these ports in the network. And so when I go look at the equipment that we build, Moore's Law has done an absolutely fabulous job on we can do so much in a single chip now. And so a lot of the systems that you see out there, and Cisco builds them, a lot of people build them, is there'll be a single ASIC on the board, and that fans out to maybe 32 optics on the faceplate. And the number of optics is important because that's the number of things you can connect to. And so optics becomes, and thermals become an issue, because we got to figure out how to fit everything into that module and make it small enough that I can put 32 of them in there. And then all of those things generate heat. And so how do I get the heat off that so that it doesn't stop working?
But we've had 32 port switches a long time ago, like with, 10 gig ports, right? So what's going on today that it's of special interest to you?
Well, a couple of things. By the time that we had those 32 ports of 10 gig had probably been around for 10 years or more, right? So the service providers would have been running OC192 a long time ago, and so that technology has had time to mature and integrate and get to lower powers. And so by the time we were putting 32 of them in a switch, the power of that 10 gig wasn't too bad, and technology matured. So we knew how to build these things. It wasn't such a problem. So fast forward to the last few years, we're now looking at how to solve 400 gig as an example. That's been the last number of years. And so 400 gig, what we would have typically seen, so using your 10 gig example, the first generations of 10 gig, when I joined Cisco, the 10 gig module I was working on was the size of my laptop.
Really?
Right. So we weren't
form factor?
No, it was no.
Just a line card or something?
It wasn't pluggable. We just screwed it to the board, right? And had a pigtail going to the faceplate. And because it was so big, we could put heat, it was easy, not easy to cool, but we had a lot of area to cool it. And we didn't have very many of them on the board because it was so big. And so typically what you see is when you move into the pluggable realm, and pluggability adds so much value to everyone, actually. Mm-hmm. The customers, gives them flexibility as a module designer. You build it once, you build the type of module you want to build, and you can sell it to many. And as a system designer, we can go and build our equipment to accept this pluggable shape, and we can go and work with a number of different module companies to go do that. So everyone kind of wins from an ecosystem point of view, and we just get the economies of scale. And that's why pluggable is so successful, right? So as some new technology comes in, typically it started out quite large because it was new, it wasn't integrated, and we'd start with a larger form factor pluggable module. And then over time, it would shrink down to something that was small enough for every application. And that's when you would see some of these high density 32 port or 48 port equipment. And that's when the volumes would really, really take off. So you'd have sort of the early adopters of the technology that would more be worried about the longer reaches. And then as that technology matured and got smaller and lower power, we were able to shrink it down into these small modules. And everything just still worked, right? So that was just kind of the life cycle that happened over and over again. And when 400 gig came along, a couple of things happened. Normally, something like the service provider networks would be the first ones pushing on the higher speed, and they were typically more interested in the longer reaches, sort of tens of kilometers or even longer. But for 400 gig, the web scale users and the network operators, they were looking at 400 gig at the same time. So we had this confluence of need from these two different applications. And what that meant is we needed to figure out, in terms of, everyone would like to go and build one thing once and be able to sell it to everyone. And so we had to solve two issues, which was how do we get the long distance optics into the same form factor as the shorter optics. So how do we find a common form factor that works for all the reaches? And how do we get that form factor to be the size that allows us to get the density that we need? So there's 32 ports. And that has happened, but I've never seen it happen before. So 400 gig, that was the first time that had ever happened, that for the first generation of a technology, we had a single common form factor, and you could argue we have two single common form factors that supports all the reaches from copper cables all the way up to DWDM interfaces. And I think that's been a fantastic exercise the industry's gone through, and it's been really, really hard. The reason that I thought talking about the thermals is interesting is the way that we've had to go do this is we're pushing, because it's 400 gig, we're pushing really advanced technologies within the module itself. We're up to 50 gig or 100 gig optical lanes, and we have 50 gig electrical lanes coming from the system, from the ASIC and through the connector. And there's a lot of complexity within the module translating from that 8 wide 50 to whatever it is going on in the optics. And there's a lot of complexity. We call it the DSP or the CDR, that the chip that's in there is doing a lot of work. And then the optics in there is doing a lot of work. So all of that actually is pushing the power up quite high. And this was a fundamental problem that as an industry we were looking at, because the modules that existed in the industry that we knew how to use were the SFP module and the QSFP module, sort of the quad SFP and the SFP. And those two are high volume workhorse form factors. And typically the QSFP was specified at about a 3.5 watt was the number that most people aimed for. And so we knew how to put 32 of those things in a line card, and we knew how to cool them at 3.5 watts.
Now you were saying that with the 400 gig, you have to accommodate not only the short reach optical technology, but also the longer reaches, which draw more power, right? Or consume more power. Why wasn't that such a big problem with 10 gig SFP plus, for instance?
Well, it was. If we tried to do that in the first generation of 10 gig, it would have been impossible. So, that 10 gig module that I talk about that was the size of my laptop, that was a 2 kilometer optics. Right. And so we just never would have been able to shrink it down into something like the SFP. So that took 10 years of industry effort.
Okay. So you had the benefit of not needing the small form factor for short reach applications until you'd already gone through the 10 years of.
Correct. Right. So we were able to leverage so much. Right. And with the transition to 400 gig, we didn't have the time. But we did have the advantage of a bunch of other things. The silicon technology had got, Moore's Law had really come in and helped us, so we could have these fairly complex DSPs, and those were quite small and had a lot of functionality in them. So that was available to us, and we were pushing up the speeds on the optics because we realized that we needed to have fewer optical components in there. So for something like 400 gig, if I can do it 4 lanes of 100 gig, that's a lot lower power and a lot easier to build than 8 lanes of 50 gig. Mm-hmm. And so that's what was pushing us to get to those higher speeds as well. So all those things kind of came together, and then it was like, how are we going to go fit all this into this module? The obvious one to go use is a QSFP because it was already in high volume, and people would like to maybe plug in, the lower speed QSFP into the same port. That's what we've been able to do in the past.
Right, the backward compatibility.
The backward compatibility, which is so important to many customers, not to all customers, but to many customers, it's very important. And so figuring out how to go do that into a module that was arguably being used for 3.5 watts, when we were predicting it could have been 12 to 15 watts and maybe even higher. And the reality is it is higher once you get into the DWDM technologies. Mm-hmm. And spoiler alert, we're now cooling 25 watt modules in a form factor that previously did 3.5.
That's astounding.
It is, right, and it's fascinating. Like this is one of the things I love about the career I chose of engineering is if you give a problem to a group of very smart people, they will solve it. And it wasn't easy to solve, but it was solved. And this is the root of the split between QSPDD and OSFP. Because from a Cisco, and obviously I'm very biased on this topic, but from a Cisco point of view, we looked at this and we said that backwards compatibility is so important to our customer base. We've got to go figure out how to solve this in a way that's backwards compatible. And so we came up with this concept called QSPDD, which we don't need to spend much time on it, but we extended the connector a little bit so that you could still plug the old module in. The shape of the hole in your equipment was the same, and it would just plug in. But if you plugged in the double density, there was an extra row of contacts, and it would go deeper into the connector, and you would get double the number of electrical lanes.
And that's where the Cisco perspective comes into play, right? Because if we were just doing optics for optics' sake, then, there's a whole world of possibilities, but we know that backward compatibility is so important for the people that actually, plug these into the switches and routers.
Absolutely.
So that's a priority for us, right? Because that's just what we know is
right
important at the end of the day, right?
That's absolutely true, right? And the other aspect is cost is very important.
That was the second part of my conversation with Mark Nowell. Next time, we'll go further into thermals. Subscribe to this podcast, and we'd really appreciate you helping to get the word out. Share this with friends and colleagues that come to mind when you think of network technology and optics, and leave a review on Apple Podcast, formerly known as iTunes. We're also on all the other major podcast platforms. You may see the Cisco Podcast Network come up when you search for Cisco Optics Podcast. That's where we live, and you can find other great podcasts there too. Also, check out the Cisco Optics blog at blogs.cisco.com and search on hashtag Cisco Optics blog, no spaces and no hyphens. We also have educational videos on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com and search on Cisco Optics. Thank you for listening. This is Pat Chow, Product Manager at Cisco Optics. The next episode is part 3 of my conversation with Mark Nowell. Until next time.